Doctors, when did you know you had to save a patient from their home? A tough-looking dad brought his 12-year-old son into the emergency room complaining about chest pains, but I could already tell he was lying to me. He stood with his arms crossed, explaining that the kid had been whining about his chest hurting for 2 days. He kept insisting it was probably just growing pains, or the boy trying to get out of school. The boy sat on the examination table looking small and scared. He held his arms wrapped around his chest like he was protecting something. When I asked him to point to where it hurt, he gestured vaguely at his whole chest area. His dad rolled his eyes and muttered something about wasting everyone's time. I started my standard examination, checking his breathing and heart rate. The boy flinched when I touched his ribs on the left side. His father noticed and told him to stop being a baby. Something about the kid's reaction seemed more than just tenderness. He was guarding that area like he was afraid of more pain. "Can you take your shirt off so I can examine you better?" I asked gently. The boy looked at his dad with panic in his eyes. His father told him to hurry up and do what the doctor said. Very slowly, the boy pulled his shirt over his head. There were some old bruises on his back that had turned yellow-green. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. I ordered a chest x-ray to check for rib fractures or other injuries. The father complained about the cost and said this was unnecessary. He kept checking his phone and seemed agitated about being at the hospital. The boy stayed silent through all of this, just watching his dad carefully. While waiting for radiology, I tried to engage the boy in conversation to see if I can figure out what was really going on. I asked about school and friends, but he only gave one-word answers. His father answered for him mostly, saying the kid was shy and didn't talk much. Every time the boy started to speak, he'd look at his dad first as if asking permission. The x-ray technician took the images while the father waited in the hallway. I noticed the boy seemed to relax slightly when his dad wasn't in the room. He even smiled a little when the tech made a joke. But as soon as we headed back to the exam room, he went quiet again. When the x-ray results came up on my screen, I had to look twice to make sure I was seeing correctly. There was something in the boy's chest that shouldn't be there. A small metallic object lodged between two ribs. It was thin and appeared to be penetrating into the chest cavity. I called in a senior physician to confirm what I was seeing. We both agreed this needed immediate attention. The object could be anything, and its location near vital organs was concerning. We needed to ask more questions about how this could have happened. Back in the exam room, I showed the father the x-ray. His face went pale when he saw the foreign object. He immediately started demanding to know what it was and how it got there. The boy shrunk back on the table, pulling his knees up to his chest. The father's voice got louder as he accused us of making a mistake. "This has to be wrong," he kept saying. "He just has chest pain. There's nothing in there." I explained that we needed to investigate further and possibly remove the object surgically. The father was getting angrier by the minute. He said they were leaving and would get a second opinion somewhere else. But hospital protocol required us to investigate unexplained injuries in children. A social worker joined us to help assess the situation. She asked the boy directly if he knew how the object got into his chest. He shook his head but wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. His father kept interrupting, saying the boy was clumsy and probably fell on something without realizing it. The tension in the room was building. The father's anger was making the boy more anxious. I suggested speaking with the child alone for a few minutes to get a clearer medical history. The father refused at first, but the social worker explained it was standard procedure. Reluctantly, he stepped into the hallway. As soon as the door closed, the boy's whole demeanor changed. His shoulders sagged and tears started rolling. I sat down next to him and waited, letting him know he was safe to talk. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "It's not the first time." I asked him to clarify what he meant. He explained that this wasn't the first time he'd had something stuck in him. Sometimes it was push pins. Sometimes it was small nails. His dad would get angry when he drank and do things. The boy would try to pull them out himself, but this one was too deep. My hands were shaking as I documented what he was telling me. The boy kept talking, the words pouring out like he'd been holding them in forever. He talked about being careful not to let anyone see at school. I asked about his mother, hoping there was another adult who could protect him. His response made everything infinitely worse. He looked up at me with those tear-filled eyes and said the words that would haunt me. "My dad does mean things when he drinks. You should have seen what he did to my mom." That's when the dad stepped back into the room. His eyes darted between me and his son while I quickly caught the nurse's attention behind him with a small hand gesture. "What's taking so long?" he demanded, his voice getting louder than before. The boy immediately pulled his knees tighter against his chest. I told the father we needed to run some additional tests, and maybe he'd want to grab some coffee from the cafeteria while we worked. He dropped into the chair next to his son's bed and crossed his arms. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. The boy went completely rigid beside him. I watched his small hands grip the edge of the exam table until his knuckles turned white. The social worker arrived within minutes and introduced herself professionally. She explained that standard protocol required separate interviews for any unexplained injuries in children. The father's jaw tightened as he leaned forward in his chair. He insisted there was nothing unexplained about kids being clumsy and falling on things. Caroline McConnell from the hospital security positioned herself casually by the door, while the social worker continued explaining procedures. She was good at making it look like she just happened to be standing there. The father noticed her uniform and started shifting in his seat. "Are you people trying to accuse me of something?" he asked, his face getting red. I pulled up the X-ray on the computer screen again and turned it toward him. I explained that we could see a foreign object that needed immediate medical attention. We had to determine how it got there for treatment purposes. The father stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "We're done here," he said, reaching for his son's arm. The boy flinched away from his touch. Security stepped forward as I stood between the father and his son. I stated firmly that we couldn't discharge a child with a potentially life-threatening injury. The hospital had a legal obligation to provide emergency care. The father's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "Get me someone in charge right now," he shouted. The charge nurse arrived and calmly but firmly explained the situation. She told him that leaving against medical advice with a minor in critical condition could result in law enforcement involvement. The father sat back down but kept muttering about lawsuits and how we'd be hearing from his lawyer. While the adults were going back and forth, I noticed the boy touching his chest where the object was lodged. He winced slightly with each breath he took. His respiratory rate was definitely increasing from when I'd first examined him. I documented this in his chart along with noting possible complications developing. The social worker requested that the father step outside to complete some paperwork while we prepared for the procedure. He refused at first, saying he wasn't leaving his son alone with us. Caroline moved closer to the door and the social worker repeated her request more firmly. After several tense moments where nobody moved, the father finally stood up. Caroline escorted him to a separate waiting area down the hall. The moment the door closed behind them, the boy started crying quietly. Tears rolled down his face as he looked up at me. "It's been there for 3 days," he whispered. His small voice was barely audible. "It hurts more now when I breathe." He admitted he was too scared to tell anyone because of what happened to his mom. I sat down next to him and asked him to tell me more about his mom while the social worker took notes. The boy's voice got even quieter as he told me his mom had been in the hospital before, lots of times actually. He said his dad always told the doctors and nurses that she fell down the stairs or walked into a door. The social worker's pen moved quickly across her notepad as she wrote down everything. She excused herself and stepped into the hallway with her phone already in her hand. I could hear her talking urgently to someone on the other end about getting CPS involved immediately. While she was making calls, I picked up the desk phone and dialed Tyler Hancock's number from memory. Tyler was our best pediatric surgeon and he answered on the second ring. I explained we had a 12-year-old with a foreign metallic object lodged between his ribs and clear signs of abuse. He said he could be there in 20 minutes and to get whatever imaging we needed ready for him. The boy watched me hang up the phone and his eyes got wide with worry. I told him we needed to do another scan to see exactly where the object was sitting, so we could remove it safely. His first question made my heart hurt because he asked if his dad would be mad about more tests costing money. I sat down next to him and promised that his safety was the only thing that mattered right now. The social worker came back in and said CPS was sending someone immediately. She helped me get the boy ready for transport to radiology for the CT scan. We wheeled him down the hallway on a gurney even though he could walk, because hospital policy required it for patients going to surgery. The transport nurse was a kind older woman who chatted with him about video games to keep him distracted. Halfway to radiology, the boy suddenly grabbed her hand and started talking fast. He told her that sometimes his dad made him stand really still against the wall while he practiced throwing things. The nurse kept her face calm, but I saw her jaw tighten as she listened. She pulled out her phone and started documenting everything he said word for word. The boy kept talking, saying his dad called it target practice and if he moved or cried, it got worse. The CT scan took about 15 minutes and the boy stayed perfectly still the whole time. The tech praised him for being such a good patient and gave him a sticker even though he was probably too old for stickers. He stuck it on his hospital gown anyway and managed a small smile. Back in the exam room, Tyler was already there looking at the images on the computer screen. His face was serious as he pointed to the screen and showed me what we were dealing with. The object was a brad nail, about an inch long, pressing right up against the pleural lining of his left lung. There were early signs of infection starting to develop around the entry wound with some fluid buildup. Tyler said we needed to get him into surgery immediately before the infection spread, or the nail shifted and punctured the lung. I agreed, and we started making preparations for emergency surgery. Just then, Caroline's voice came over the intercom saying the father was demanding to see his son. She was trying to keep him in the waiting area, but he was getting aggressive and threatening to call his lawyer if we didn't let him in. The boy heard his dad's raised voice through the door and immediately curled up into a ball on the exam table. Tyler told me to stay with the kid while he went to deal with the situation. I could hear him in the hallway explaining to the father that we were completing our medical assessment and he needed to wait. The father's voice got louder, demanding to know what was taking so long and accusing us of kidnapping his son. Caroline called for backup security, and within minutes 2 more guards arrived to help contain the situation. The father kept yelling about his rights and how he was going to sue everyone in the hospital. About 10 minutes later, a woman in a business suit walked into the exam room and introduced herself as Valeria Dominguez from CPS. She had a thick folder of paperwork and a serious expression on her face. She sat down with the social worker, and they went through all our documentation together. Valeria read through the boy's statements, looked at the x-rays and CT scans, and reviewed the photos we'd taken of his bruises. She said this clearly met the criteria for emergency removal, and she was starting the legal paperwork immediately. She pulled out her phone and called someone at family court to get an emergency custody order started. While she was on the phone, the hospital's legal team arrived with their own stack of papers. The lead attorney explained that given the life-threatening nature of the injury and the evidence of abuse, we could proceed with emergency surgery under implied consent. They said the father's permission wasn't required when a child's life was in immediate danger. Tyler came back and said he was going to scrub in for surgery and we should have the boy ready in 30 minutes. The legal team prepared all the necessary paperwork, while Tyler headed to the surgical suite. I went back to the boy to explain what was going to happen next. I told him we needed to do surgery to remove the nail safely before it caused more damage. His eyes filled with tears, and he asked in a small voice if his dad would be there when he woke up. I promised him that we would make sure he was safe and that lots of people were working to protect him now. He nodded slowly, seeming to understand more than any 12-year-old should have to. The anesthesiologist came in to start preparing him for surgery and explained how he would go to sleep and not feel anything. Just as we were getting ready to wheel him to the OR, 2 police officers arrived and asked to speak with the father. Through the door, I could hear the father immediately start denying everything and claiming his son was making it all up for attention. He said the boy was always trying to get him in trouble, and this was just another one of his lies. The officers kept asking him questions, and his story kept changing about how the boy might have gotten hurt. First he said the kid fell on something at the playground. Then he said it must have happened at the school. Then he claimed he had no idea how it happened. The officers weren't buying any of it and told him he needed to come with them for formal questioning. The nurses were already getting the boy ready for surgery while his father stood in the hallway with the officers. I helped wheel the gurney toward the pre-op area and the boy grabbed my sleeve with his small hand. He whispered something about his mom and asked if I could call her to let her know what was happening. His voice was shaky, but he recited her phone number from memory like he'd practiced it 100 times. I wrote it down on my notepad and promised I'd try to reach her while he was in surgery. The anesthesiologist came over with her cart of equipment and started explaining everything in a calm voice. She showed him the mask and said it would smell like bubblegum and help him fall asleep. The boy asked if taking the nail out would hurt, and she shook her head. She promised he wouldn't feel anything at all and would wake up when it was all over. We wheeled him through the double doors into the OR where Tyler was already scrubbed in and waiting. I stepped out to try the mother's number, but it just rang and rang with no answer. The social worker was standing nearby, so I told her about the unanswered call. She immediately got on her phone to request a welfare check at the family's home address. The dispatcher said they'd send a unit right away to check on the mother. Through the hallway window, I could see the father getting more agitated with the police. He kept trying to walk away, but they blocked his path each time. One officer was explaining that he was detained for questioning about child endangerment. The father's face turned red and he started shouting about his rights and needing to leave for work. More security guards showed up and surrounded him when he tried to push past the officers. They had to physically restrain him when he swung at one of them. Meanwhile, in the operating room, Tyler was carefully working on the boy's chest. He called me in to look at something on the monitor. There were 2 more small metal pieces embedded deeper in the tissue that hadn't shown up clearly on the X-ray. Tyler took photos of everything and carefully removed each fragment. He documented every detail for the evidence file. The scarring he found suggested this had been happening for years. There were old puncture wounds that had healed over and new ones that were still fresh. Tyler worked methodically to remove all the foreign objects and repair the damaged tissue. The boy's vitals stayed stable throughout the whole procedure. After about an hour, Tyler finished closing up and said everything went well. The boy was moved to recovery where the nurses monitored him closely. I went to find the detective who'd been questioning the father. He was in a small conference room going through paperwork. He told me they were building a strong case and needed all our medical documentation. Then he mentioned something that made my stomach drop. This wasn't the first time they'd dealt with the father. There had been previous reports, but nothing they could prove until now. About 30 minutes later, we got a call from the officers who'd gone to check on the mother. They'd found her at home with bruises on her face and a swollen eye. She kept saying she fell down but wouldn't give any details. The officers convinced her she needed medical attention and brought her to our emergency room. She arrived looking scared and beaten down. Her left arm was held against her body like it hurt to move it. The triage nurse brought her to a room far from where her husband was being held. Back in recovery, the boy was starting to wake up. His eyes fluttered open and he asked for water in a hoarse voice. The recovery nurse gave him ice chips and checked his bandages. He touched his chest gently and asked if the bad thing was gone. She told him yes, everything bad had been removed and he was going to be okay. He seemed to relax a little at that. Valeria had been busy making phone calls and filling out paperwork. She came back with a stack of documents and said she'd gotten an emergency custody order. The on-call judge had reviewed the evidence and granted CPS temporary custody. The father would not be allowed any contact with his son. She explained this meant they could make all medical decisions and find a safe placement for him. The boy would be protected now. I checked on the mother who was getting x-rays of her arm and ribs. She wouldn't make eye contact with anyone and kept insisting she was fine. The bruising pattern on her arms looked like finger marks. Her lip was split and starting to scab over. When I asked how long this had been happening, she just shook her head and looked away. The nurse documented everything and took photos for the file. The father was eventually taken away in handcuffs, still yelling about lawsuits. The boy never asked about him again that day. About 2 hours later, the officers who'd gone to check on the mother brought her through the ER doors, and my heart sank seeing her condition. She had a black eye that was swollen almost shut, and dark bruises running down both arms that looked like someone had grabbed her hard. The triage nurse rushed her to a room on the opposite side of the emergency department from where we'd been dealing with her husband. I went to check on her while Valeria stayed with the boy, and she was sitting on the exam bed holding her left arm against her ribs like it hurt to move. When I introduced myself and explained I'd been treating her son, her face crumbled and the tears started coming hard. She kept saying she was sorry over and over and that she should have stopped him, but she was too scared he'd kill them both if she tried. The nurse helped her change into a hospital gown, and we could see more bruises across her back and shoulders, some fresh and purple, others older and turning yellow. I ordered x-rays for her ribs and arm while she told me this had been going on for years, getting worse every time he drank. She said he'd started hurting their son about 4 years ago when the boy was 8, using pushpins at first as punishment for small things like not cleaning his room fast enough. The x-ray tech came to take her for imaging, and I went back to coordinate with the trauma team about her care, making sure everyone knew to keep her separated from her husband, who was now in police custody downstairs. When she came back from radiology, she begged to see her son once he was stable enough, and I promised we'd arrange it as soon as possible. The boy had been moved from recovery to a regular pediatric room by then, and seemed calmer without his dad around. A volunteer brought in a therapy dog, a golden retriever named Buddy, and for the first time I saw the kid genuinely smile as he gently petted the dog's soft fur. The handler sat next to his bed talking about being brave and how even strong people need help sometimes, while the boy nodded and kept stroking the dog's head. Nikki was in another room telling Valeria everything, the whole awful story pouring out of her now that she felt safe. She explained how her husband would put small objects into their son's skin when he was drunk and angry, starting when the boy was just 8 years old. She'd been too terrified to report it because he threatened to kill them both if she ever told anyone, and she believed him because of how violent he got. The detective arrived to take her full statement, and she gave him dates and specific incidents that matched up with the boy's old medical records we'd pulled. She remembered the exact day 3 months ago when he'd used a thumbtack because the boy forgot to take out the trash, and another time 6 months before that when he'd pushed a small nail into the kid's shoulder for talking back. Tyler came by to check the boy's surgical site and told him everything looked good with no signs of infection or complications. He explained in simple terms that all the bad things were gone now and wouldn't come back, and the boy touched the bandage gently like he was making sure it was real. Valeria had been working with her supervisor to develop a safety plan that would let mother and son have supervised visits while Nikki got treatment and counseling. They'd both stay in a protective shelter at first where they'd be safe and have support from trained staff. The prosecutor's office called to confirm the father was being formally charged with aggravated child abuse, assault, and domestic violence based on all our medical evidence and witness statements. His bail was set at $200,000 with strict conditions including no contact with either victim if he somehow made bail. I spent some time with the boy showing him breathing exercises for anxiety, having him breathe in slowly through his nose and out through his mouth while counting to 4. He practiced seriously, focusing hard on getting the counting right, and told me it helped when his chest felt tight from being scared. The child life specialist brought a stack of books about feelings and safety, spreading them out on his bed so he could pick which ones he wanted to look at. He immediately grabbed one with a knight on the cover fighting a dragon, flipping through the pages while she explained how brave knights protect their kingdoms, just like he'd been brave telling the truth. The mother's x-rays showed 2 cracked ribs and a hairline fracture in her left forearm, injuries consistent with defensive wounds from trying to protect herself. The orthopedic team put her arm in a sling and wrapped her ribs while she winced but stayed quiet, used to dealing with pain in silence. The boy asked the nurse if his mom was okay, and she assured him the doctors were taking good care of her, which seemed to relax him a little. Security stayed posted outside both rooms just in case any of the father's family showed up, though none did that first day. The detective spent 3 hours taking statements from all the medical staff who'd been involved, building his case piece by piece with our documentation and observations. Nikki arrived at the hospital the next morning with fresh bandages on her face and met with Valeria in the family conference room down the hall from the pediatric ward. She sat forward in her chair and pulled out a notebook, writing down every resource Valeria mentioned about shelters and support programs and counseling services. Her hands shook a little, but she kept writing, asking questions about how long things would take and what she needed to do to keep her son safe. Valeria spread out pamphlets about different programs while Nikki studied each one carefully, circling phone numbers and underlining important dates. The meeting lasted 2 hours with Nikki filling 6 pages of notes about parenting classes and job training programs and legal assistance. She told Valeria she'd do whatever it took to protect her son and get them both away from her husband permanently. Later that afternoon, the boy had his first supervised visit with his mother in his hospital room, with a social worker sitting in the corner taking notes. Nikki walked in slowly and sat on the edge of his bed, reaching out to take his hand while tears rolled down her face. She started apologizing over and over for not protecting him better, for not stopping his dad sooner, for letting things get so bad. The boy squeezed her hand and told her it wasn't her fault, that dad hurt her too, that he understood why she couldn't stop him. They sat there holding hands for 20 minutes while the social worker documented their interaction, and the boy showed his mom the books the nurses had given him. The next day, a forensic interviewer trained in child trauma came to conduct a detailed interview for the criminal case against the father. She set up a camera in a quiet room and spent 3 hours talking to the boy about everything that had happened over the past 4 years. He told her about the first time when he was 8 and spilled juice on the carpet and his dad pushed a thumbtack into his arm. He remembered the exact date because it was right after his birthday party, and he'd been so happy that day before it happened. The interviewer asked gentle questions and let him take breaks when he needed them, giving him paper to draw pictures when words got too hard. He drew their house and marked all the places where bad things happened: the garage where dad kept his tools, the basement where he'd hide when dad was drinking. his bedroom where Dad would come in late at night. The boy provided dates and times and specific details about at least 12 different incidents, each one documented carefully for the prosecutor. 2 days later, the medical team held a discharge planning meeting in the conference room with me and Tyler and the head nurse and 2 social workers. We reviewed his surgical recovery, which was going perfectly with no signs of infection and good healing at the incision sites. Tyler showed the latest x-rays confirming all foreign objects had been successfully removed, and there was no damage to surrounding organs. The physical therapist reported the boy was moving well with full range of motion, and no pain medication needed anymore. Everyone agreed he was medically stable for discharge, but would need follow-up appointments for wound checks and eventual scar revision if needed. The psychiatrist recommended immediate trauma therapy starting within the week, and gave referrals to specialists who worked with child abuse survivors. We scheduled surgical follow-up for 2 weeks out and made sure all the paperwork was ready for wherever he'd be placed. That evening before my shift ended, I went to check on the boy one last time and found him sitting up in bed coloring in a book about dragons. He looked up when I walked in and smiled. A real smile this time, not the scared fake one from that first day. He put down his coloring book and thanked me for believing him when nobody else had before. He said other doctors had seen the bruises at the school physicals, but never asked the right questions or pushed when his dad gave excuses. He told me I was the first one who made him feel safe enough to tell the truth about what was really happening at home. I sat with him for a few minutes and told him how brave he was for speaking up, and that things would get better now. Meanwhile, Nikki had been admitted to the emergency department for her own injuries, which turned out to be worse than she'd initially let on. The x-rays showed 2 fractured ribs on her left side and extensive bruising across her back and arms consistent with being hit with objects. She had internal bruising around her kidneys that needed monitoring, and a concussion from being slammed into a wall 3 days earlier. The doctors wrapped her ribs and put her on IV antibiotics to prevent infection, while she gave her full statement to investigators about years of abuse. She cooperated completely, providing dates and medical records from previous emergency room visits, where she'd lied about falling downstairs or walking into doors. She showed them photos she'd secretly taken on her phone of bruises and cuts, evidence she'd been collecting in case she ever got brave enough to leave. 3 days after his surgery, the boy was up walking around his room, doing laps with the physical therapist and eating solid food without any problems. He told the nurses he hadn't felt this safe in years, that he could actually sleep through the night without worrying about his dad coming in angry. He helped the younger kids in the pediatric ward with their puzzles and read them stories, showing a gentle nature that had been hidden under all that fear. The nurses documented his improved mood and appetite, noting he was engaging with staff and other patients in age-appropriate ways. During this time, Valeria had been working to find a specialized therapeutic foster placement that could take both mother and son together once Nikki completed her initial medical treatment. She called dozens of facilities before finding one that had space and specialized in keeping families together during recovery from domestic violence. The placement included individual and family therapy, job training for Nikki, educational support for the boy, and 24-hour staff trained in trauma response. They'd have their own small apartment within the facility where they could start rebuilding their lives while staying safe from the father. The prosecutor spent a full day reviewing all the evidence we'd collected, including medical records, photographs, x-rays, witness statements, and the boy's recorded interview. She laid out everything on a conference table, organizing it into a timeline that showed the escalating pattern of abuse over 4 years. She called me to clarify some medical details about the injuries, and how they couldn't have been accidental based on their location and pattern. With the physical evidence of objects embedded in the child's body, and the mother's documented injuries, she decided to pursue maximum charges, including aggravated child abuse, assault with a deadly weapon, and domestic violence. Hospital social services connected Nikki with a legal aid lawyer who came to her hospital room with divorce papers and applications for emergency restraining orders. The lawyer explained each document while Nikki signed with steady hands, no hesitation now that she'd made her decision to protect her son. They filed for emergency custody and orders preventing the father from coming within 500 feet of either victim. The next morning, a child therapist came to the boy's room with a box of art supplies and sat on the floor while he stayed on his bed watching her carefully. She spread out paper and markers without saying much, just drawing simple shapes and leaving space for him to join if he wanted. After about 10 minutes, he slid off the bed and picked up a black marker, drawing what looked like a stick figure with something sticking out of its chest. The therapist kept her face neutral while he added more details, a bigger figure holding something sharp, then a smaller figure hiding under what might be a bed. He drew for almost an hour, filling 3 pages with scenes that made my stomach turn when I saw them later in his file. The therapist documented everything, noting how he pressed hard enough to tear through the paper on the violent parts, but used gentle strokes for a yellow sun he added to one corner. Meanwhile, the hospital's legal team pulled all the security footage from the day the father brought his son in, finding multiple angles of him grabbing the boy's arm hard enough to make him wince in the parking garage. The cameras caught him shaking the boy when they thought no one was looking, then switching to a concerned parent act when staff walked by. They had footage of him trying to physically drag his son out of the exam room before security stopped him, his face twisted with rage as he shouted threats about lawsuits. The prosecutor added every frame to her growing file of evidence. 3 days later, the boy was medically cleared for discharge, and the nurses who'd been sneaking him extra pudding cups gathered to say goodbye. One of them gave him a stuffed bear she'd bought with her own money, and he held it against his chest like armor. Nikki walked beside him in a wheelchair, still healing from her own injuries, while Valeria led them through a back entrance to avoid any chance of running into anyone from the father's family who might be watching. The unmarked van took them 20 miles to a shelter that looked like a regular apartment building from the outside. Their room was small but clean, with 2 single beds and a window that actually got morning sun. The boy immediately started arranging his few belongings on the nightstand, the bear in the exact center, his discharge papers folded neatly beside it. He tested the lock on the door 3 times before finally relaxing enough to sit on his bed. Nikki watched him create his little safe zone, tears running down her face as she realized this was the first time he'd had his own space that felt secure. While they settled in, the father's lawyer was meeting with prosecutors, trying to negotiate lesser charges in exchange for a guilty plea. The prosecutor laid out all the evidence, including medical records showing 4 years of suspicious injuries, the objects removed from the boy's body, photographs, and the boy's recorded statement. The lawyer tried arguing for assault charges instead of attempted murder, claiming the father never meant to cause serious harm. The prosecutor laughed and showed him the x-rays again, pointing out how close the nail had been to puncturing a lung. She made it clear they'd pursue maximum charges and likely win, given the overwhelming physical evidence and multiple witnesses. 2 weeks passed before I got an update from Valeria about how they were doing. The boy had started attending the school connected to the shelter, where teachers understood that kids might need extra time or suddenly need to leave class if they got scared. He'd made friends with another boy who'd been through something similar, and they ate lunch together every day. His surgical site had healed completely, just a small scar that would fade with time. The teachers reported he was actually really smart when he felt safe enough to participate, especially good at math and drawing. Nikki had started her own journey, meeting with counselors every day and attending group sessions with other women who'd survived domestic violence. She had to complete assessments about her mental health, substance use history, and parenting abilities. The shelter required her to attend parenting classes too, learning how to help her son heal while dealing with her own trauma. She threw herself into every program they offered, determined to become the mother her son deserved. The boy started attending a weekly support group for kids who'd been hurt by people who were supposed to protect them. The first time he walked into that room and saw 8 other kids his age, something shifted in his face. The counselor had them do activities instead of just talking, building things with blocks and playing games that helped them learn to trust again. During his 3rd session, he actually spoke up, telling another kid that it wasn't their fault their dad hurt them. The counselor noted it was the first time he'd shown awareness that the abuse wasn't normal or deserved. 3 months after that day in my ER, I heard the father had finally accepted a plea deal. His lawyer had convinced him that going to trial would mean the boy testifying, and the jury would see those x-rays and hear those recordings. He pled guilty to multiple counts of child abuse and domestic violence, receiving 8 years in state prison with no possibility of early release. The boy didn't have to face him in court, didn't have to relive those memories in front of strangers. The prosecutor called it a victory, though 8 years felt too short for what he'd done. Around the same time, Nikki got hired through a program that helped domestic violence survivors find work. She started in the mailroom of an office building, basic work, but with health insurance and steady hours that let her be home when her son got back from the school. The boy was thriving in his new school, his teachers sending home notes about how helpful he was with younger students, and how his reading level had jumped 2 grades once he felt safe enough to focus. 6 months after that terrible day in my emergency room, Nikki sent me a photo of their new apartment with a note saying Victim Services had helped them get their own place. The boy had decorated his bedroom walls with drawings of superheroes he'd made in art class, and there were pictures everywhere of him and his mom doing normal things like eating ice cream and playing board games. They were still going to therapy twice a week, both separately and together, learning how to talk about feelings without getting scared or shutting down. The counselor taught them breathing exercises and ways to handle bad memories when they came up at night. Nikki was working full-time now at the office building, getting promoted from the mailroom to reception after her supervisor noticed how reliable she was. The boy had started playing soccer at his new school after the gym teacher noticed him kicking a ball around during recess. He wasn't the best player, but he loved running around with the other kids, and Nikki never missed a game, always standing on the sidelines with the other parents cheering. She told me later that watching him play with other kids without being afraid was worth more than anything. The team made it to the district championship that spring, and even though they lost in the semifinals, the boy was grinning in every photo. A year after everything happened, I got a letter in the mail with shaky handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a picture of the boy holding a soccer trophy for Most Improved Player, his smile so wide it took up half his face. He'd written that he wanted me to know he was doing good in the school and had lots of friends now. His mom had added her own note saying she'd been promoted to administrative assistant and was taking night classes 3 evenings a week to become a medical assistant. She said helping other families going through hard times had become her goal, and the program would take 2 years, but she didn't mind the work. The boy's teachers were sending home report cards with A's and B's, noting how he always helped younger kids who were struggling with their homework or seemed sad. He'd become the kid who noticed when someone was having a bad day and would share his snacks or sit with them at lunch. One teacher wrote that he had an unusual ability to make other children feel safe, probably because he knew what it was like to not feel that way. They'd built a whole network of people around them, other families from the shelter who understood what they'd been through, counselors who checked in regularly, and new friends from the school and work who didn't know their whole story but cared about them anyway. Nikki had joined a support group for survivors that met every Thursday night, while the boy stayed with a neighbor who had kids his age. The bad days still came sometimes. usually when something reminded them of before, like the smell of beer or loud voices in the hallway. But they had people to call and ways to get through it. The boy kept a journal where he wrote down good things that happened each day, and Nikki had started doing the same thing after seeing how much it helped him. 2 years after that horrible emergency room visit, I ran into them at a community health fair where I was volunteering. The boy was taller now, almost 14, working at a booth for the youth center where he volunteered every Saturday morning. He was teaching younger kids how to make friendship bracelets and telling them jokes that made them laugh. Nikki was at the next booth over, handing out pamphlets about domestic violence resources and talking to people about warning signs to watch for. She'd become certified as a peer counselor and spent her free time helping other women navigate the court system and find safe housing. Her medical assistant classes were going well, she told me. Just one more semester until she could start working in a clinic. The boy had joined the high school junior varsity soccer team and was thinking about trying out for basketball too. His grades were good enough that his counselor was talking about advanced classes next year. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment now with a small balcony where they grew tomatoes and flowers in pots. The boy had his own computer for homework and walls covered in posters of his favorite athletes. Nikki had been promoted twice at her job and was making enough money that they didn't need assistance anymore, though they stayed connected to the programs that had helped them. They'd transformed everything that happened into something that could help others, turning their worst nightmare into proof that people could survive and build something better. The boy told me he wanted to be either a doctor or a social worker when he grew up, someone who could help kids the way people had helped him. Nikki just smiled and said whatever he decided, she knew he'd make a difference because he already was. Your turn. What exact moment proved he was finally safe, and why? Put it in the comments and help someone see the signs.